So, hi everyone, and welcome to the second event in the Diverse Voices online series. I'm Asher Aslam. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Leeds and one of the co-chairs of the series. Regan, if you could move forward one slide. So just a bit of housekeeping. So we're going to be recording the session today, and we'll stop recording before the Q&A starts. So there's an opportunity for a full and open discussion. For those of you who may not be so familiar with Zoom, there's some tips on the current slide, which you might find useful. We encourage people to have their cameras on if they can, so it doesn't feel like a room with nobody in it, but don't feel pressured to if you don't want to. We have one speaker today, and that's Dr. Anita Ganesan, an associate professor within the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Anita, who will introduce herself a bit more and share with us more about her own experiences working within the field. Could I please ask you remain muted throughout the discussion today? We'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the session for a Q&A. At this time, please do raise your hand if you have a question at the end, or if you prefer, feel free to put your question in the chat and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. For those of you who are new to RMETS, RMETS is the professional body and society for weather and climate. They're there to support their membership and the wider meteorological community and do that through their work in publishing, event provision, which supports professional development and wider interest in meteorology, and through public engagement and formal education activities. EDI was formally embedded into the RMET strategy in 2021, and the Society has since established a new EDI working group, a group of fantastic volunteers from a range of different backgrounds, all with lived experiences and skills to help RMETs develop and deliver activities to help make meteorology a more welcoming space as a science profession and sector. This series is just one initiative that has come directly from the EDI working group. So discussing the last event, we mentioned how from the recent EDI survey that from the members who filled out the survey and who we'll take to represent the membership as a whole, we noticed a real lack of ethnic diversity. And some of us from non-white backgrounds could also tell you maybe that even anecdotally, we see a similar lack of diversity in the field of weather and climate overall. So the two things we have on offer, so the Diverse Voices series, as in today, is here to celebrate the diversity that already exists in the field, to demonstrate to young people in early careers that there are others like them, and that there are more people from similar backgrounds who have climbed the ladder. At each event, you, the audience, will get a chance to ask your questions to the speakers. Diverse Voices also is great as anyone can attend, anyone can listen, learn, ask questions, and join the conversation. And if the survey showed us anything, is there's some misconceptions about who has a voice in the field, and hopefully we can provide role models and show what's possible to early careers of colour, and also introduce the wider RMETS membership to some new or different perspectives. Regan, could you put on the third slide if that's okay? And for Diverse Voices, the next event in June will have Dr. Leila Gohar and Dr. Michael Lai talking about their experiences as people of colour at the Met Office. So if you'd like to stay involved, keep an eye on the RMETS events page or newsletters for future talks. We also do have an Early Careers of Colour network, which we're going to be using for people to see and share opportunities around jobs, PhDs, postdocs, etc., or even just to chat about interesting talks and articles and get to know each other. And it's intended to be a place for discussion and support for people in both academia and industry. And the more people involved, the better. We'd like the society and weather and climate in general to be welcoming to all. And we have, that's what we have. So we hope these initiatives can start some necessary, maybe tricky conversations that can help bring about some change that will benefit everyone. And we hope to eventually have an in-person meetup. So for anyone who's attending the summer's Early Career Student Conference, keep an eye out for that. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll be taking a slightly different approach as we only have one speaker today. I'll first allow Anita to introduce herself and we'll have a more conversational Q&A, imagine a panel discussion, but with one person to kickstart the discussion. And afterwards, I'll open the floor to any questions. So Anita, please introduce yourself and tell us about what you do and your career path.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm really pleased to be able to kick off this whole series, I guess. So I really think it's a great thing that you're trying to set up here. And I hope that, there's lots of really interesting speakers and voices kind of from around the country and beyond over the next year. So what I've been asked to do is just to give a little sort of introduction about myself and my career path before we kind of get into actually going into questions and getting maybe a little bit more conversational about my experience so far. So I don't want this to read like a CV. So what I thought I'd just do is I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my kind of upbringing and how it all started for me. So as you can probably gauge from the accent, I'm not British. So I grew up in the United States. And I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, about an hour outside of Boston, to a family that came from India. So my parents were born and raised in India, did all their education in India, and moved to the United States quite a long time ago at this point. But my brother and I were sort of the first generation born in the United States. And, as a result of that, as you can maybe imagine, that my parents were very, very serious about our education. So that was really, the fundamental pillar of our whole house was, doing well in school and being very attentive to academics and everything beyond that. So it's just a little bit of context, I guess, for how I grew up in the sort of mentality around academia, and my sort of career path, I guess, was embedded very early on in terms of my family upbringing. So I did all of my education in the United States. So that's, again, maybe slightly different to some of you who might be coming from, again, all over the world. And I make that as a point here because, as you'll see, there is a difference to how things are approached in the US, I guess, versus Britain and other places. So that might come across in everything I say. But so I did my undergraduate degree at Cornell University, which is in the state of New York in the US. And I actually did an engineering degree. So that was my first sort of maybe point of differentiation from a lot of people coming into weather and climate nowadays that I particularly see with our PhD students and postdocs. My background in engineering is not the norm, I would say, for people working in weather and climate. But I did that engineering degree, and then I worked for 2 years after I finished my degree. So I had a 4-year undergraduate degree, and then I worked at a laboratory based outside of Washington, D.C., where we were actually designing miniature mass spectrometers for planetary science missions. So again, nothing really to do with weather and climate, but actually very, very related in terms of the kind of engineering and scientific principles. We were looking to detect chemical compounds, right? So that's not all that dissimilar, I guess, from what we're doing on Earth. Obviously, with the difference that the whole focus was on making everything teeny tiny and weighing nothing, and you want to be able to launch these off to Mars, they have to have a lot of different engineering principles behind them. But so my initial interest really was in planetary science, had nothing to do with weather and climate. Okay, so I guess that's the very first thing to say, which is I came from a slightly different trajectory. I had those 2 years of work experience, which I think was very valuable because I was really exhausted after my undergraduate degree. It was long and it was hard, and I really feel like those 2 years gave me a bit of breathing room. So it was nice to earn some money. That was obviously great as well to do that, not going straight from education to education. It was nice having a bit of money. I think it was nice just being in an environment where I wasn't really thinking about assessments and examinations. I kind of had a broader goal for those 2 years that had nothing to do with, as we know, doing exams and whatnot. But I think the big thing is it gave me that breathing room was really, really key for me because it actually gave me a chance to spend some time thinking about where I'd want to go. And the biggest decision for me to come out of that is I loved planetary science. And I actually wanted to kind of move away from the engineering side more into the science side of planetary science, right? So rather than necessarily on the kind of design of instruments and the sort of engineering principles, more on the actual, well, what are the scientific findings that these instruments bring to us? And so that is the point that I decided I would apply for PhDs rather than kind of sticking within the engineering trajectory of potentially getting a master's or just even carrying on working in my in that same laboratory. So I decided over those 2 years I would apply for graduate programs and PhDs. And because I'm in the US at this point, you got to remember the US is a massive place as well, right? So it's not like Britain where most things are kind of a few hour train ride away. I was applying all over the country. I had a few places in mind, and the extremes were that I was in love with Arizona. I love the University of Arizona in Tucson, which is in the middle of the desert, completely different from where I actually ended up going, which was in Boston. So I kind of spread it was the whole spectrum of places around the US that I was considering. And I traveled and visited all of these places as well. So that was a really nice thing about having those 2 years, was they actually gave me time to physically go and look. I wasn't trying to kind of squash this into, a few weeks where I was trying to cover everything. So that was really nice, is that at least in the programs there, they invited me to come visit all of these different places around the country. So that was a really nice thing. Um, so at the end, I was given a few different offers, and the Arizona was one of them. MIT and Boston was another one of them, and I had to really carefully consider why I would choose one over the other, because I really loved the University of Arizona. I loved the program out in Tucson. They had big observatories. It was really, really nice, beautiful. But ultimately, I decided to go to MIT because there were two main reasons. And one was that my family, again, remember I grew up in Massachusetts, they were all outside of Boston. So I had at that point, remember, worked for 2 years. I had moved away to Washington, D.C. So the idea of actually coming back to being near my family was actually a real big selling point for me. Particularly because, again, the main point of difference is that the PhD programs in the US are 5 to 6 years long. They're not sort of 3 to 4 years like they are here in Britain. And so it's quite an extensive amount of time to sort of commit to saying, I want to be elsewhere. And so that was a big reason for me to choose going there. And then the second thing was obviously being at somewhere like MIT, I had a variety of different engineering and scientific sort of disciplines that were being, obviously MIT is working on all sorts of different angles related to science and engineering, even within the field of planetary science, right? So they do a lot of the engineering work as well as the scientific work. So that was a big appeal to me, is just having that variety and still not being entirely sure what I wanted to do. So, I'm kind of making it seem as like I had it all mapped out. But, I was still young. I'd been working. I didn't really know the field. It's not like I had an idea of everything, the ins and outs, like I kind of feel like I know now. I really didn't know anything. And so I was just sort of taking a punt and saying, okay, well, I like this broad field, but I don't really know really anything about the whole field and what the ins and outs are. So I did want to leave myself the option of being able to meander a bit if I needed to. And I think that's why I ended up choosing MIT, because I knew there would be options to kind of wiggle around should I not really know what I was getting myself into. So in terms of the PhD, I think what was really unique, and I appreciate this might not be kind of true for everybody doing a PhD, but I think I had a lot of freedom during that time. It was a long period of time. It was 6 years. And when you do something for 6 years, the idea there is that you are very independent, right? Because you, like everyone, you start off the first couple of years, you don't really know what you're doing. There's a lot more guidance, a lot more having to rely on other people for things. But then as it goes on and on and on, I mean, you just start becoming much more independent, so that you are technically still a PhD student. But when you're year 5, year 6, and you've been working on this project for so long at this point, that you really are truly kind of an independent researcher at that point. And that was incredibly valuable, I think, to my future career, because I think I got a lot of confidence with that independence very early on. And the second point is I didn't have a lot of, I guess I personally didn't feel like I had a lot of outside obligations during that time, which is the bit that I'm not sure is sort of relevant to everybody, because everybody comes in with different constraints, right? And things that are happening during their PhDs. But for me, I didn't have a whole lot of other things and other obligations. And it just meant a lot of focus for me for quite a long period of time on a single thing. And that was obviously very good for me, because I really got to just get into something, become really independent very early on. What I did for my PhD, so I didn't tell you the fun part of this, is how I actually got into weather and climate, right? The kind of point of this, which is that I started in planetary science working with a really brilliant advisor who is incredibly successful, famous, all those things. But I ended up actually switching out of it after the first year, because I ended up just wanting to do something with data. And I got into a field where it was incredibly theoretical, right? So this is now talking about, I was working on exoplanet research, and this is now, what is it, like 15 years ago. And this is before there was the James Webb Telescope and all these other things that was bringing loads and loads of data. It was still, the kind of infancy of that whole field, right, of exoplanet research. And it's very different now today. But at the time, what I was looking at was a PhD that was almost entirely theoretical. And that didn't really appeal to me, because I think partially because I came from that kind of engineering background where I was working physically with real things, and going from that to a complete kind of theoretical framework just didn't totally suit me. So after about a year, I ended up wanting to switch into something that had much more data associated with it, and data analysis and all of that. And so after the first year, I kind of realized that it wasn't really what I was truly interested in, even though I still think it is some of the coolest research out there. And I would hands down say I fundamentally think that that stuff is probably more interesting than what I do day to day, even still. But it just didn't suit me in terms of what I was after for my PhD. And so I started then asking around different faculty members at MIT for whether they had other opportunities. And that's how I ended up getting into what I'm doing now. And there was another professor that had funding and just said, sure. It took a lot of, it wasn't an easy switch to make because I had already basically lost a year at this point. And the way things are done in the US at a lot of institutions is that you have to take an exam after a couple of years. It's called a, well, they call it different things, but after sort of 2 years of your PhD program, there's usually some sort of, or there used to be at least, some sort of examination that determine whether you then stay on to the PhD program or whether you need to leave for the master's or whether you just decide to stop altogether. And that examination was obviously very specific to the kind of field you were in. And I was trying to move from something that was planetary science into something that was atmospheric science and climate science. So it was a completely different exam. So I was playing catch up basically in order to take that exam. I had lost a year of coursework. And so I almost kind of had to double up on coursework in the second year just to be able to stay on track to do the exam after the second year. So I had a very, very, very busy second year where I was trying to combine 2 years of coursework into one, essentially. But it went really well. I really loved it. I got really into my work. And so I ended up doing a PhD that was looking at developing instruments, so again, kind of bringing in that engineering background, developing instruments, but now looking at measurements of different greenhouse gases and substances just destroying the ozone layer. The idea is that I actually built an instrument and deployed it to a place in India, collected all the data myself, and then did a whole lot of looking at data assimilation algorithms to try to interpret like emissions from South Asia. So really, in some sense, you would consider a very, very, very different PhD to what I had initially signed up for. But I loved that it was incredibly hands-on, that I was in the lab making the instrument for the majority of it. And over that time, because it was, again, a substantial amount of time, I was able to apply for bits of research funding. So I got a bit of experience applying for little pots of money. They weren't massive, but they were, it was a start, having to put together a proposal and trying to get my own funding just to support the additional costs that go with doing a field project. I developed quite a large sort of international network over that time, just because, again, it was working in a field like climate science, which is very international, huge networks. It wasn't an isolated project. And so for that reason, I just met a lot of people and did a lot of sort of networking over that time. But I was very, very focused on my PhD and the work that I actually didn't write any publications out of my PhD. I did a huge amount of work over 6 years, but never find the time to actually get it all published. And part of it is because when you're doing data collection, anything that involves developing instruments and sending them out to the field, collecting data, it takes a lot of time. It's not a trivial thing to have enough data to write a publication, within a year. And so I finished my whole PhD not having written a single paper, even though I had done a huge amount of work. And, at that point, I wanted to come to the UK because I had gotten married to a British person. We wanted to come back to the UK. I had applied for fellowships, I didn't get any. I didn't get any in my first lot of applying for any fellowships, mainly because I had no publications. So, whether that's fair or not, I guess we can talk about that. Is that a right way of evaluating somebody? But I didn't get them. So I ended up just moving to the UK by taking a temporary postdoc in Bristol that was initially 6 months long, I think maybe extended to a year. But then over that time, I had published all the stuff coming out of my PhD. And then when I got to the second round of applying for fellowships is when I started getting the interviews and everything. So I found it at that point much, I think what went in my favor is because I had so many years of what I would consider very independent research is I found it very difficult or very easy, to convey that independence in a fellowship interview because I already kind of knew that I had done all this stuff on my own. So I felt like it naturally came to me how to convey that independence, which is often what they're kind of asking for or looking for in these fellowship interviews. So yeah, it was disappointing not getting that first round, but once I did get it, it felt like I had enough to talk about. I didn't sort of have to worry too hard about what they were after. Yeah, and then I wanted to remain in Bristol after that. I had a NERC fellowship for 5 years, but I still didn't get a position at Bristol for a few years after that. So I was still on a fellowship, but not on a proleptic position. And this is kind of where it gets funny because I had to apply elsewhere before I actually got a position at Bristol. So that's again, a common theme I think people find is you almost have to make the time, you have to put pressure on the situation a little bit. So I had to apply elsewhere. I had to get had my first child at that point, so I didn't have a position. It was only after that when I was seriously contemplating having to go somewhere else is when the position at Bristol ended up materializing. And then since then, it's just kind of gone really, really smoothly after that. I've been promoted twice to associate professor since then. I've become a consultant for the United Nations Environment Program, and I still hold now a 10% position at MIT. So every summer, I spend 7 weeks working for MIT each year. So I've kind of kept those links going with the programs at MIT. Yeah, okay. I think I'll probably stop there. That's probably my 10-minute intro, and then I'll let the questions come on now.
Thanks, Anita. It's really nice to hear both the perspective of, for example, doing postgrad and studies in America and how it compares to the UK, and then transition to UK university life, and then seeing how all the elements kind of come together. One of the things you mentioned talked about that strong sense of family connection and having the people around you to spur you on. And that's often a common theme where if some people may want to move close to family so that they can get extra support when need be. Other people, they may have to move away and be further away from family. I'm just curious because now you're in the UK, given your trajectory in your career, is there any support you received that has been really valuable to your success? Because in some sectors and for some people, that support isn't always there, and that's quite a big EDI issue. So I'm just curious as to what support or advice you've received over the years that have really helped you.
Well, since coming to the UK, I would say, yeah, I think the family support has been beneficial because I've never felt isolated, I guess, in terms of socially or anything like that. I think having that sort of family outlet was always been useful. I spent a lot of time with my family, even when I was doing my PhD. I didn't live with them, but I'd come back every weekend almost to see them. So that was really, really nice. But yeah, since living in the UK, that was obviously a huge move for me, moving abroad. Slightly different because, I did have a family, I was married and everything. So I, again, wasn't totally on my own. But in terms of getting advice, I think the biggest advice the biggest thing that has changed my career in terms of advice that I got is that I wasn't going to be applying to these other places. I knew I wanted to stay in Bristol. And we had a two-body situation and various things. We lived here, I had a house, we were really settled here. But it was almost having to be convinced that I should apply elsewhere. And that was the thing that then spurred on everything else, which is I really don't like to say that because I don't think people should have to do this. And I don't think it's the right thing necessarily, but I kind of had to take a bit of a look at the situation and say, why am I kind of waiting around? And should I just wait or should I just make my own sort of decisions and say, let's just see what happens? And it was that spurring on from some of my colleagues saying, just apply, apply to these positions elsewhere. You don't have to take it, but at least you may as well apply and see where it goes and see what comes back and maybe get the experience of what it, getting interviews and other things offers you. It took a lot of convincing for me to actually do that step. And ultimately, it was that step that then drove things happening here in Bristol. But yeah, I'd say that was the sort of biggest advice I had. And I've had a lot of support from my colleagues just in general on a social level mainly, is that I've always just felt really part of a kind of a nice group of staff here at Bristol to the point that, I've just enjoyed my time. Like it's just been an enjoyable time as opposed to kind of feeling isolated. I feel like there's been a really nice community.
It's really nice to hear whenever someone can talk about their workplace in such a positive light, both
Yeah.
socially and in terms of the academic stuff. You received support both on a personal level, but also the extra bit of drive that you may need to maybe submit an application.
Yeah.
It's really, yeah,
It
it's
takes a
really,
lot of energy
really
to apply for things. That's the thing. It takes not just physical time, but it takes a lot of mental energy to apply for things, especially when you're not sure you really want to do it. And yeah, that was kind of I needed a bit of a kick on that one because Yeah, because for the reason I just said, which is that getting over that hurdle of saying, okay, fine, let's go through this process, even if it's not, something that you definitely want to do. Um, yeah.
I mean, considering those kicks, we'll call them, one thing you mentioned earlier was about your transition from one field to the other and how it can be quite a difficult process. And as someone, for example, who's almost approaching the last year of PhD, finding positions afterwards which align with the work I've been doing over the past however many years, it can be difficult, and finding those opportunities can be quite is it's a huge puzzle, and I'm a bit terrified about it. And some things, for example, I've considered is changing tack in terms of what kind of field or aspect of science I look at. What advice would you give someone who is considering this a change in their field or change in the science they do, or the way in which they approach it? So whether it's an academic position or an industry position, what advice would you give to them?
Yeah. Well, I think that I wouldn't call this advice, but I should say an observation is that, because obviously been a lot involved in a lot of hiring myself, right, in terms of postdocs, not hiring, but taking on new PhD students, etc. And I have to say, I don't think that the field that you previously had is as important as people might think. So, you might think I've done exactly this work before, therefore I should do exactly this work next because I have all this experience already. Some of the best people that I've worked with have not necessarily come from the same field, but it's just obvious that they're bright people that are very good at problem solving. And that has been the thing that I've always looked for, as opposed to it being that, you come in with this particular set of knowledge already, right? Because I think some things can be taught and then some things are just sort of innate to a person. And I think it's those things that are innate to a person that I think are more important to look at, right? In terms of, can you tell that they're just going to be quick to kind of grasp things and solve problems and be independent and sort of figure out what they want to do? I don't think that's field related. So my advice would be not to worry so much that you might not have the exact right textbook background for a particular topic, and think about how you might tailor your application to show what it is are those kind of innate strengths of yourself as opposed to content, right? Because I don't think it should be about content. I think it's about everyone's so young, right? Content can still be accumulated over years and years and years and years. I don't think you should kind of pigeonhole yourself and say that I only know this so far. I think it should be about what you think your underlying strengths are. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It goes back to your earlier point about, for example, when you were doing your PhD, no publication came out initially, and obviously still there's that notion where people value a lot of what they've done in terms of their output, as you said. But in other ways, you've brought up other skills, such as your way of tackling a problem or just approaching an issue, which, oh, I don't know how to do it initially, but then you develop those skills later on. And kind of answered one of my questions I had about any skills you thought were really important. I think just for interest of time, I'm going to ask for the recording to be stopped, if that's possible. And we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So if there